Hello, everybody, and welcome to what I hope will be the first of many sessions that we'll have around the Ethical Business Forum. Ethics have never been more important than they are right now in all our lives, and particularly in business. It's not enough just to do business. Good business means behaving correctly and ethically, not just for the people who work for us, but also for the environment and the communities that we live in. At CGI, we feel very, very strongly about this and care deeply about that. And I'm delighted to say that I've been joined by such a fabulous panel to have quite an interesting and heated debate, hopefully, on the topics that surround that. So I'm going to ask you all to introduce yourselves. And I think I'm going to kick off with Erica. If you would just say a couple of words, Erica, that would be amazing.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon. I hope you can hear me. So my name is Erika Bozzai, and I'm representing OECD, so the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, which is an international organization based in Paris, France, but I hope it doesn't really need further introduction. And I work as a senior policy advisor at the Infrastructure and Public Procurement Division within OECD. I'm looking forward to the discussion today.
Fabulous. Thank you very much for that, Erica. And also, we've also got another guest, external guest, B. Delgado. B, do you want to say a couple of words to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Tara. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for the invitation. My name is B. Delgado. I am the Senior Programme Manager at the UN Global Compact Network UK. For those of you that are less familiar with our organisation, we are the world's largest corporate social responsibility initiative, and we support our members on their sustainability journey. I'm really looking forward to the conversations today and look forward to getting started. Thank you.
Fabulous. Thanks for that, B. And last but not least, I'm going to introduce you to Matty, who is our very own Chief Sustainability Officer at CGI UK. Matty, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thank you, Tara. Hi, everybody. I'm Matty Yetta and CSO for CGI 3 months into the role. And CGI is a fantastic organization that deeply cares about ethics and sustainability within the environment that we serve and operate. I also do have a ex-government hat, so hopefully I'll be able to bring in some of my insights and knowledge from UK Gov and my experience of working with organizations such as the UN Global Compact, and ILO and several others, OECD. Very excited, Tara, today that we are launching the Ethical Business Forum, which is a forum that looks to bring governments, suppliers, individuals, companies together to share ideas and insights, knowledge, experience, and expertise on all things ethics, and in particular, a special focus on supply chain. But ethics is such a big topic that we could easily delve into the technology and the ethics surrounding that. But I think the main focus for today's session will probably focus on supply chain, and hopefully the subsequent sessions will talk a bit further about the technology elements. Yeah. So thank you very much, and really looking forward to this debate.
Super. Thanks, Matty. Just a reminder to everybody who's listening in, we're really hoping that you'll ask a few questions yourselves. So if something crops up as we go along, if you want to type it into the chat on the platform, then I can see all the questions, and at the end we'll have a go at answering as many as we can. That said, we do have a bit of a few organised questions to get us up and running. So I'm going to kick off by just talking straight away to Erica, mostly about supply chain itself. I mean, the focus on supply chain, in your view, how is it changing?
Thank you very much for the question. And of course, thank you very much for inviting OECD for this launch event. As I mentioned in my introduction, I'm representing here the Infrastructure and Public Procurement Division from the OECD. So in my intervention, I would like to focus mainly on the public sector and the potential role and impact of public procurement strategies and operations on creating sustainable and responsible ethical supply chains. And before I answer your question, as a general background, I would like to mention that in the last few years, OECD had a comprehensive program, a special program that focused on how to incorporate responsible business conduct standards into public procurement. If you visit the OECD webpage, you can find relevant materials on this topic. We did a big stock-taking exercise, understanding how OECD countries are approaching this topic, whether it's high on their agenda or not, whether it is translated in their policy and regulatory framework. And also we try to look at the let's say, the practical implementation. And we even focused on a specific sector in the second phase of this project, on the textile sector, understanding how all these kind of RBC standards are implemented in public procurement in the textile sector. And I think it's also really important to mention to you that although I'm representing here that division which is dealing with public procurement, we implemented this program jointly with our colleagues from the OECD RBC Center, who are really focusing on the work around responsible business conduct and having really intensive work with multinational enterprises, and not just multinational enterprises, but other business sector elements. So we brought these two different angles into this program. And also one additional general comment that the question of supply chain is a highly relevant topic for OECD and also for those people who are dealing with public procurement. And here I would like to mention that we will hold our usual working party meeting on public procurement in early October. And the overarching topic for the 2 days discussions with the OECD country representative is basically how governments and supply chains can better work together to deliver sustainability. So I think this is also somehow emphasizes the importance of supply chains also for the public sector and public service delivery and public contracts. And now coming back to your question, I think we can definitely experience changing approaches towards supply chains in the public sector. Recent events, especially the COVID-19 pandemic, showed the world how supply chains are critical to the delivery of essential public services. The pandemic also showed that behind the overall numbers and amounts of public contracts, there are businesses of all size, global, multinational ones, and local ones. And the crisis also revealed what was already emerging from leading practices even before the pandemic, that the delivery of sustainable and resilient public services requires governments to move beyond a simple client-supplier relationship, where the public clients just dictate how and when private suppliers should respond to their needs. And the pandemic also made clear that getting supplier relations right is core to improving the agility and resilience of public service delivery. But I think the pandemic also made clear that a one-size-fits-all approach to supplier relationship management was not sustainable in the light of the fast changing conditions and needs. And last but not least, I think this pandemic also made it clear for several governments, and especially for their public buyers, that they don't really have proper visibility over their supply chains. So they had of course, some information about the main contractor, the main suppliers, but then they realized that they don't really know what is happening in the lower tiers of the supply chain. Who are the actors who are in this supply chain, how they are organizing their own businesses, whether they are respecting environmental standards, responsible business conduct standards, human rights, or main labor rights and the labor conditions in the different factories, in the different production states. So I would say that in this post-pandemic new reality, governments started to rethink how to rebuild and diversify their supply chains. And as I mentioned, of course, we will focus on this topic in our own work in the near future as well. So I think this is what I wanted to reply to this first question. And I'm really happy to elaborate some further elements.
That's really interesting. I was just pondering the pandemic myself, and it was quite chaotic at times, I'd say, the supply chain. And now that we're hopefully more out of the other side of it than not, do you see that government have a role now in changing how we look at the supply chain and making it more sustainable?
Yes, definitely. OECD, or at OECD, we really think that the governments have role in driving changes in supply chain. And again, in my response, of course, I would like to tackle mainly the angle of this public service delivery and how the public procurement strategies and policies can influence these kind of changes in the supply chain, and how the contractual relationships that public sector is establishing can again contribute to these kind of changes in the supply chains. I think we shouldn't forget that public procurement is a really important strategic tool or policy tool for achieving various economic, environmental, social goals. It can really contribute to the implementation of sustainable development goals. And in OECD countries, on average, every year, around 12–13% of the GDP is spent through public procurement in OECD countries. So it really highlights the economic significance of public procurement. And of course, governments have to act and purchase responsibly. They have to establish contractual relationships with those business actors who respect human rights, who respect labor rights, gender equality, integrity, and environmental standards. And again, but I already mentioned in my previous reply, governments already put a lot of efforts on assessing, evaluating the main contractor and the main suppliers, because public procurement is highly regulated. Yep. There are so many requirements, but what they can do is looking at the whole supply chain and also trying to understand, and not just understand, but also require that each element in the supply chain are also respecting all these kind of sustainability requirements, responsible business conduct. And of course, governments have different tools in their hand to do this. First of all, they can set up and shape the public procurement regulatory framework and policies and strategies. So they can create a legal framework which requires public buyers to incorporate all these kind of standards into their tender procedures. For example, incorporate due diligence in the public procurement procedure and set up these kind of standards when they are conducting public procurement procedures. But they can also establish, for example, regular forums with business sector representatives to discuss all these kind of sustainable and ethical aspects of public service delivery. And also they need to understand how the business sector can deliver on these kind of requirements and standards, and again, incorporating all these kind of standards in the whole supply chains. And on the other hand, when we are talking about governments, we shouldn't forget that governments are also acting as public buyers, contracting authorities who are, at the end of the day, establishing this kind of contractual relationships with the business sector. So when they are setting up these kind of individual tenders, they always have to incorporate all these kind of considerations in their tender procedures. And when there is about the contract implementation, they also have to do the follow-up in this regard. And I just would like to mention one thing here, that I think it's really important for the governments to rethink again or reevaluate these kind of relationships between themselves as public buyers and the supply chain, because it can provide tangible and shared benefits also for the governments, for the public sector, but also for the business sector. And they can do it only if they can build trust amongst themselves.
Yeah, but I totally agree. And a redefinition of what value for money is, I think, is very key. Speaking as an organisation that does work for the government, you know, value for money doesn't necessarily mean cheap. It can and often and should more mean ethical, correct, paying the minimum wage, ensuring that you know where things have been manufactured, etc., etc. You know, so I think moving away from value for money equaling just the cheapest option to being one that's the best, I think, is a huge shift that we're seeing in government behaviours, certainly in the UK, and I'm sure you can comment around the globe as well. And I think we'll see more and more of that, hopefully, as the years move by.
Yes, if I just may react to it, I think you highlighted a really important point. And I'm just referring back to our publication about incorporating responsible business conduct into public procurement, because one of the issues that we also looked at in this report, how this value for money concept evolved during the times. And now it already enables governments and public buyers to incorporate all these kind of, let's say, standards on responsible business conduct or environmental standards. So not just looking at, as you mentioned, the cheapest offers, but also evaluate a lot of other really important dimensions when they are making decisions on purchase.
It's really good. Thank you.
Yeah, I think firstly, I love the fact that our CEO can really talk about ethics and sustainability in this way. I mean, it just makes me feel incredibly proud to work for CGI. And Erica, I think when we get the opportunity, if you don't mind sharing those links with us, and we can circulate them to everybody on the call. I have maybe a slightly different angle in terms of questions for you. Which stakeholders have you identified as having a role in human rights? I think we heard Erica there talking in depth about the government. From your perspective, who do you think are the stakeholders that you've identified from your work?
Thanks, Matty. Firstly, I think it's important just to remind ourselves that a stakeholder is anyone who essentially would be affected by a business and its practices. And I think that understanding is key so that we don't begin to perhaps prioritise one stakeholder group over another. It's really important that businesses listen to the different voices around the table. I think also that as the UN Global Compact, we are in a unique position in that we act as a conduit, if you like, between the private sector and different stakeholder groups. And so in a broad sense, you know, stakeholder engagement includes all different aspects of society. So, you know, Erica's just been speaking about the public bodies and government, the role of government, but you also have civil society, you also have private sector actors that are non-business. And if we break it down further, you know, we're talking about things like investors, business owners, local authorities, and even subgroups within those, you know, such as communities, Indigenous peoples, human rights defenders, consumers, trade unions, and even children. So I wouldn't like to say that, you know, one particular stakeholder group is more relevant than the other. But what I would say is that as a business, when you're not going to be able to engage with everybody at the same time. So you really have to think about where you have the potential for the most impact, both negative and positive. And I think that's the first step. And then once you've identified where your impact may be, the next step is then to think about who are the right people that we should be speaking to ensure that we mitigate any harm and that we maximize any opportunities. The second thing I'd like to say is that yes, it's important for companies to engage with a wide range of stakeholders, making sure that they're bringing in different perspectives and understanding the actual and potential human rights impacts. But depending on which stakeholder group you're speaking to is also going to determine what actions are going to come out of that engagement. So if I take civil society as an example, generally speaking, NGO organisations, they are more familiar with human rights issues that take place at the local level. And that may be both at the local level within the UK, in Europe, or the global north, if you like, but also at the local level in the global south, where we know that a lot of these human rights issues unfortunately take place and they stem from these regions. So it makes business sense for the private sector to engage with NGOs because it's a better way to understand the terrain in which they're operating in, but also how local organisations can best support their efforts on the ground. You know, we're living in a time where there's huge economic insecurity and instability, not only for, you know, everyday people, but also for businesses. You know, we're coming out of the kind of post-COVID era, if you like, and that had a huge detrimental effect on everybody involved. So, you know, it's about businesses working in a smart way, pooling resources, avoiding duplication, and making sure that in order to do that, you need to be speaking to the right people. And, you know, as Erica mentioned as well, just the last point, that engaging governments is also a key factor in this entire process, because essentially, you know, they're the ones that are drafting and implementing policies that are going to impact people, but also businesses. So, you know, if as a business you want to have a voice and you want to play an active role, and that's something that I'll talk about a bit later on, the active versus reactive responses of business. It's essential that you're part of the conversation at the start, rather than kind of, you know, waiting for emerging legislation to be rolled out and then reacting to that.
That's really interesting, Erica. And one of the things I love about the UN Global Compact's website and also the OECD is that you've got a lot of information for organizations that are just setting out on their journey. If you don't mind, maybe touching very briefly for those organizations that may be on this call and are new to this topic, what would be the sort of first few steps or the things that you would highlight that perhaps they should be thinking about as they're setting out on this journey?
Thanks, Matty. Yeah, of course. So first thing to kind of put out there is that social sustainability is about identifying and managing business impacts, both positive and negative, but on people and planet. So a company's journey really should start by identifying the risk and engaging with the key stakeholders, i.e. those likely to be impacted by the business, as a starting point. My advice for those that don't have a lot of resource, have not necessarily started the journey but are thinking about it, is familiarize yourself with the existing tools and resources that are out there, and there is a lot of them. You know, we've been speaking about UN Global Compact, OECD guidelines. There is the UN Guiding Principles in Business and Human Rights, which provides a framework, and it's the kind of the initial steps, looking at human rights due diligence. It also, part of that process is stakeholder engagement. So if you want more information about what the process involves, then, you know, you have access to this framework. There are also lots of extremely valuable websites. So the Business and Human Rights Resource Centre is one, and the Institute for Human Rights in Business. You know, these are organisations that have been working on these issues for a very long time, supporting the private sector to be sensible and do the right thing. And there are also lots of different organisations like my own, where we offer support and dedicated resources to specific issue areas such as climate, such as the Sustainable Development Goals, and also human rights. So I guess once you've identified the risks, the next step is to put a plan in place to mitigate any threats to the business, but with the added consideration of the impact of the business operations on people and planet. This plan would include carrying out human rights due diligence, supply chain mapping, drafting and implementing policy, effective partnerships with relevant actors. So, for example, NGOs, government, but also participating in sectoral or multi-stakeholder initiatives like the UN Global Compact.
It sounds to me like there's lots of tools and things available for all of us to utilise. Matty, from a commercial business's point of view, then, what are you seeing maybe are the issues that businesses have when they need to navigate understanding what's going on in their own supply chains? And were you aware of all of the tools that are available to help us?
Thanks, Tara. And I think from a commercial perspective, both Erica and Bea have touched on this. The length of the supply chain is one area that organizations need to be aware of and to be mindful of. I mean, we're talking about, if you're taking the definition of the UK of a large organization, we are talking about tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, tier 4, tier 5 supply chain, which can be very complicated. Yeah. And layering on top of that, the geographies of where some of your supply chain are in the world lend themselves to different types of risks across different boundaries, different legislation. And so I think some of the things that organizations that I've consulted for tend to highlight is the complexity of that communication further down the supply chain, and how to effectively manage that. But also related to that is the data. And the ability to extract as much data and information the further you go down the supply chain. But thankfully, I think there are several organizations, OECD, UN Global Compact, that have all put guidance out on their website. But also there are several third-party organizations such as EcoVadis or the Responsible Business Alliance or Electronics Watch that organizations can partner with to help provide the information that they can not access otherwise on their own. I think the other area where organizations could access information is through governments. There's a lot of information on government and several websites, and those tend to provide a lot of information around their geographies, what to expect, legislation, and so forth. So whilst there are complexities and challenges, I think there are opportunities for partnerships with third-party organizations, but also non-governmental organizations and several other partners within your business.
I wonder, it might be quite overwhelming to think how complicated some of the supply chains are that are out there. I'm just thinking about a few of our own whilst you were talking. Have we got any top tips then, Matty, on how to make it easy for businesses to understand a complex supply chain?
Yeah, I think there's 3 top tips. The first one that's been highlighted is aim to understand your risks. There are tools, models out there that can help you understand very quickly what your risks are. And there's a lot of information today on the website on different risks across different geographies. So very simply, if you're an SME or an organization without any resources, a very quick desk research on the internet will generally provide you with some information. The second is always partnership and collaboration. Partner and work with those within your industry. They will have information. Partner with third-party organizations, NGOs. We have the OECD, UN Global Compact, organizations such as UNICEF. They all have tools and resources on their sites that will provide you with a lot of information and tools. I think there's also something in there about making use of your technology, actually, which is another really simple action that you can take within your organization. For example, we know about blockchain that is now being used to develop transparency within the supply chain. I see this within CGI and how we use blockchain for some of our clients to help map some of their ledgers and transactions. It's a very, very easy tool to implement. Other easier tools to implement, I think, include, if we want to go very complicated, digital twins, IoT, and so forth. But technology is all around us. It's evolving. It's becoming more complicated, but also very sophisticated, and is able to, whether that is map our risks and supply chain, but also provide us with information very, very quickly. And then a really final quick tip is actually a simple one around learning and development. We have the Ethical Business Forum here today where we're just sharing knowledge and insights, but also there's something about upskilling our teams and upskilling our supply chains, upskilling each other to understand this topic a little bit more.
Excellent. Thanks for that, Matty. And thanks, everybody. Right, so we've got 2 waves of questions now. I've got some in front of me that have come in slightly earlier from people out there, and then I've got, having another look through, 20 or 30 questions that people are typing in now. So if you want to keep typing in, we'll do as many as we can. We've got half an hour, but let's kick over to the first one. So with a backdrop of a focus on human rights, changing geopolitics, environment and transport concerns, will there be a transition to a more local focus on supply chains? How will it impact social sustainability over the next 10 years? Who'd like to have a think about that? What about you, Matty?
I can have a go at that, Tara. So I think that question is right. There is going to be a really strong focus on human rights, modern slavery, and several other topics. I think it's interesting that the question highlights the importance of, I suppose, localism and working in a local context. In many ways, one can argue, yes. I think some of the trends that we are seeing, including, for example, a rise in investors' requests and requirements for organizations to be a lot more transparent with their activities in their supply chain. Consumer expectations, not just locally, but actually most consumers for organizations would tend to be within a specific geography, unless, of course, you're a multinational or a large corporation, in which case then your consumers will be based all over the world. But there is that rise in consumer expectations to do the right thing, but also developments in social measures across different nations and different regions. I think the UK has the Modern Slavery Act, which was one of the most pioneering legislation globally. The EU has several other legislation, as well as the US and Canada. A rise in well-being and social justice around different localities, but also a rise in knowledge and skills of employees and members within specific organizations, which are then accelerating further requirements and standards. So yes, we are seeing the trends shifting towards a rise and an increase in social sustainability locally, but actually also within a global context, as you know, global is now becoming local and local is now becoming global. We're becoming a globalized world.
Thank you. Thanks for that, Matty. Following on for that, what are the challenges that are coming from businesses that you're hearing?
Thanks, Tara. Well, I think that one of the main challenges that we hear time and time again is the lack of support from the top of the organisation. So it's not currently, unfortunately, common practice for issues such as human rights or sustainability to be a top priority at board level. And you really need that senior level buy-in if you really want to move the dial on this agenda. And without the support from the top, your resources will be limited. Your efforts won't go as far as you'd like them to. So it's really critical that you're able to get that support from the top down and then allow that support to cascade through your organisation. And that's a big challenge, especially for SME organisations that don't have a lot of resource dedicated to this particular agenda. Another challenge is tied into this is also corporate culture. So in general, social sustainability remains in the hands of a few departments within a particular company. And then these issues only become relevant, unfortunately, when a problem arises. So, for example, incoming legislation, or there's a shift in investor expectations. So for the most part, and I alluded to this, businesses are reactive, and what we'd really like to see, and we support our members at the UN Global Compact, is a shift so that businesses become more proactive. And this shift in mindset and approach is necessary so that we ensure sustainability issues become a fabric of the business and not just a tick box exercise or a compliance exercise or a nice to have. I mean, to be honest, the list could go on and on in terms of the challenges, but I like to think of every challenge as an opportunity for business. So, you know, we've spoken of the post-pandemic and economic impact, the aftershocks of COVID-19, how that continues to impact businesses in terms of their availability of human and financial resources. And I think that's why it's so instrumental that if you don't have a lot of resource, going back to Matty's 3 top tips, you know, form good partnerships, meaningful partnerships, whether that's with NGOs, whether that's across a multi-stakeholder initiative. You know, this is a way to pool resources, not duplicate effort, not reinvent the wheel, but actually allows a business to balance your bottom line with both emerging legislation, but also other external pressures, such as supporting sustainable and inclusive growth. And then the last challenge that I'd like to touch on is the use of jargon. And, you know, for those of us that are practitioners in the sustainability space, it's really easy for us to kind of get lost in the language, and we're extremely familiar with what it means and what the terms signify. But it's important for businesses who are at the start of their journey not to get lost in all of that and in the fog, and to really set realistic expectations for themselves. So it's more about incremental progress and tackling the key issues where they have the biggest impact. Now, in human rights terms, we call this saliency. But what we don't want is for companies to become overwhelmed with what they don't know or understand, but rather present them with language that is both relatable and also meaningful for their business. So if a company, for example, prefers to understand this agenda in terms of health and safety or risk management, there's nothing wrong with that. You know, if this language helps sell the agenda internally, then I'd say go for it. If it means using these more kind of well-known terms will guarantee more budget set aside to work related on these type of activities, then that's a bonus. You know, frame the conversation in a way that resonates with your business and act proportionally so that you can begin to demonstrate meaningful action that hopefully leads to more positive impact.
I think that's really good, and reach out and find like-minded people would be my add-on to what you're saying as well, because you can save a lot of time and effort if you can find someone who's maybe one step further on the journey than you are. And I find that companies are all happy to share in this space. This is not competitive advantage. This is just doing the right thing. Super. How about this one then, Erica? Do we need consistency in approach from businesses in this area, do you think?
Thank you for the question. Yes, definitely we need this kind of consistency in approach from businesses. And again, going back to public procurement, I think we not only need consistency from businesses, but what we also really need is this kind of two-way communication between the public sector and the business sector to deliver jointly on this sustainability agenda. And basically, I could repeat all those challenges that we just heard from the business sector perspective, because these are the challenges also for the public sector when they would like to implement the sustainability agenda in their public contractual relationships. And when I said that we need this kind of two-way communication between the business sector and the public sector, I wanted to refer to this kind of changing concept of market engagement, preliminary market engagement. Those who are familiar a little bit with public procurement practices and regulation, they know that, let's say, even 10 years ago, I think everybody was talking about the ban of having any kind of communication between the public sector and the potential bidders. But this is now changing, and also the legal frameworks provide this opportunity for the public sector and the business sector to engage with each other before publishing a tender notice or before, starting the public procurement procedure. Because again, in order to advance with the social sustainability, especially, I think public sector needs to understand what the business sector can offer in this regard, but the business sector also needs to understand what are the real needs of the public sector. And we already touched upon this value for money and the changing concept of value for money. So it's really important that the public sector also communicate this kind of changing concept to the business sector, to the potential bidders, that they are expecting them to offer in their bids higher standards regarding human rights or labor rights or environmental standards. But we also would like to avoid to set up these kind of bars so high that no one can respond to these kind of needs. So that's why I'm saying that it should be a joint journey. The public sector is now in a position when they can set up these kind of requirements in their tender requirements. But again, they also need to understand where the market is. And I don't want to say that they have to set the bar only on the level, which is, the level that the business sector can afford. Of course, they can set this bar a little bit higher, but again, they have to do it together. And we also mentioned earlier that it's really important to have cooperation, collaboration between different stakeholders. And of course, it's also true for public sector. And one of our main recommendations and findings was in the OECD report on incorporating responsible business conduct into public procurement, that public sector also have to cooperate much more with other stakeholders, not just the business sector, but also NGOs, or for example, trade unions, to understand what are the main issues in some factories or in some industries in terms of labor conditions. But of course, there are other organizations that they can cooperate, because their perspective is also really important, and it should be also incorporated in any kind of approaches and strategies that the public sector is setting up for advancing this social sustainability agenda.
Excellent, thank you for that. Okay, so shall we have a look at some of the free format questions that have come in? I'll just take them as they came. So, you know what, I'm even going to have a go at answering the first one myself, because I think I probably got a bit of experience of this. So the question is the practice of flying business leaders, executives in private jets an ethical one, and how do we mitigate the impact of global travel for businesses? Being someone who doesn't do that but gets the train a lot, as people who know me will know, it is difficult to influence upwards. I think we probably all know that. But with the rise of science-based targets, and with certainly in CGI with the push towards having climate and carbon budgets, that helps give everybody a common language of how much carbon a journey on a private plane would be, or to travel business class, or versus staying in country and doing the meeting remotely. Now, some meetings for sure need to happen in person, but not maybe as many as we thought before the pandemic. And I think all businesses are reassessing that at the moment. And you know, we know how hot it is today, those of us in the UK. I think we're all aware of the fact that we do have a part to play in this, and that business travel won't be as frequent and as costly as it was before. So I hear your frustration, the person who raised the question, but I do think that it's something that we are and do have tools and mechanisms in place now to start putting more pressure on making the right decisions. I don't know if anybody else wants to comment on that one.
Tara, I think just one small comment from me. I think the question also highlights the link between environment and social, and actually that the two topics are very, very closely aligned. And I completely agree with you, Tara. Need to set the science-based targets, and need to set your climate target, your net zero target, which ultimately then shapes the behaviors and shapes the targets and approach of an organization, including travel, which is within your scope 3 activity of your science-based targets and approach.
So it's going back to the previous point of having a common language in business. Once we measure things, we tend to understand them better. So I think we are on this road now. But I hear the frustration in the question. Here's another question for the broader panel. Could the panel advise on defining a robust, sustainable supplier strategy? What would be your top 5 inclusions? Thoughts on that, team?
I have a go to start.
Off you go.
Okay. So I think for me, the first would be around governance, making sure that there's a robust governance model in place for you to be able to capture, report, feedback, information and activities on what's going on within the supply chain, but also have that support of your leadership team or your managers to be able to drive robust decisions where things aren't going right or decisions just need to be made. Engagement is the second one, robust engagement and plan to make sure that you're being inclusive of everyone down to your tier 5 supplier. Some of that takes very different shapes and forms, including surveys, questionnaires, third-party organizations, and so forth. The need to have holistic and robust strategies and metrics to measure progress. I know one of the things that I've realized after working for quite a few organizations and also consulting, is there's this notion that actually social sustainability doesn't have hard measures, but you can incorporate hard measures within your social sustainability that you can then monitor and measure and report on, which is the sort of fourth tip. And then finally making sure that you're including sustainability within your procurement and sustainable procurement criteria, that you're making sure that you're asking those that you do business with to adhere to your standards, and vice versa, that you're adhering to very high standards that they may be requesting of you. So I think those are my top 5 tips, and not forgetting learning and development. I don't know if anybody wants to add something to that.
Yeah, I can jump in, Matty. I mean, I completely agree with all of the top 5 tips that you've given. And I would just add from my end, you know, ensuring you've got robust policies that you can then lean on and rely on should anything happen, to kind of demonstrate to your suppliers the expectations and setting that off from kind of the offset of the relationship, but also being able to then rely on those policies to guide your future actions with said suppliers in the eventuality that, you know, something untoward happens within the supply chain. The second thing as well that I added to my list is remedy. I think really understanding how do you continue engaging with suppliers where there is no access to remedy for their own workers, but also for those further down the supply chain, and what implications does that have? Now, remedy is an area that for even the companies that have been kind of operating in this space for decades, it's an area everyone finds challenging. You know, remedy is one of those things that it's so subjective to the individuals affected, to the context, to the situation, but that doesn't negate from the responsibility that companies have both at the top end of the supply chain, but also through suppliers. And so ensuring robust grievance mechanisms and remedy procedures is going to alleviate some of that pressure and tension that companies face. And it also demonstrates goodwill, but also good practice, because if you have a robust remedy framework, you can then share that and cascade that through down to your suppliers. And it becomes then about building their capacity, not necessarily to match your kind of standards, but at least work towards it.
Excellent, that's really good. I think we've got a question directly for Erica here. So Erica, as governments are procuring on behalf of the public, what do you believe the best way is for citizens to put pressure on their governments to raise their ethical and sustainable stance in public buying? What do you think?
It's a really good question. And I think we can already see this kind of pressure or expectations from the public or from the taxpayers in this regard. And this is also the reason why governments are putting much more focus on these kind of, let's say, social aspects of sustainability, because I think the so-called green public procurement, so incorporating environmental aspects in public procurement, was already high on the agenda for almost a decade or even more or longer time. But these kind of social aspects becoming more and more relevant and important for governments only in the last few years. So I think in this regard, of course, NGOs, civil society organizations can also help taxpayers and citizens to express these kind of expectations towards the government. Of course, it's really difficult to say what citizens can do, but again, they can use these kind of NGOs or other professional organizations to support their own actions to raise awareness of this topic. And of course, what is also really important that there are a lot of information and data that is available on public contracts, on public procurement. And of course, citizens can also look at this data. But again, in this regard, I think it's always important to rely also on the research institutions and again civil society organizations, NGOs, who can help really to understand this data, analyze this data, and somehow enlarge all these kind of expectations and volume up these kind of voices from the citizens towards the government. So I just would like to encourage everybody to really express these kind of expectations, and they can also use the media or even the social media to express these kind of expectations towards the government.
Yeah, excellent point on the social media, because it's more and more prevalent. There's a few questions around this topic, and I think this one perhaps pulls it together the best. So, how important is it to differentiate companies that are making a real contribution to improving ethical business standards, as opposed to virtue signalling or greenwashing organisations? Thoughts on that? B, any thoughts on that one?
Thanks, Tara. Yeah, I mean, it's difficult because, no one necessarily is advocating for greenwashing. And as I spoke about it earlier, it's not about compliance, auditing, meeting, kind of doing tick box exercises or viewing sustainability as a nice to have, something that's altruistic and something that's going to make you feel good. I think it's important for companies and the wider community to view this as good for business, as well as good for the planet and good for people. And it's really difficult. And I know I'm not really answering the question in terms of, how do you set aside the companies that are kind of greenwashing versus those that are doing the right thing for all the right reasons. But I would argue that it's still not as bad as the laggards that aren't doing anything at all.
Yeah.
So, change has to happen. It's incremental, and people are going to kind of operate at different paces. And so, it may look like kind of virtue signaling or greenwashing to, from an outsider's perspective, but it may mean for the particular organization that they are very limited with the resources. They're very limited with buy-in from the business and kind of all the other challenges that we've been discussing today. So kind of rather than highlighting, that what may or may not be their motivations for doing something, I'd focus more on the fact that something is being done and focus efforts on companies trying to raise the bar and get the laggards to join in, because essentially now this is becoming a race and it's not necessarily a race to the top that I'm referring to. It's a race against time, especially when it comes to climate, but and then also intrinsically linked to that, people and the impact that we're having on our planet and an adverse impact that we're having on local communities as a result of that. So I think less attention on perhaps the motivations for why businesses are doing something, and let's focus efforts to kind of raise the bar and make sure that those that are the laggards kind of rise to the top and join us on the journey.
That's really good. And I suppose linked to that, one of our questions is, what are the recommendations for divorcing yourself from unethical businesses? Which is quite an interesting point. Have the panel got any ideas on maybe what they've done in their own lives on that, or top tips for people listening?
So I will actually start with that, Tara, because actually the UN Global Compact and the OECD have recommendations on how to deal with that, as well as the UK government and several other governments. I think the first thing that we always get advice on is to make sure that we are not creating further impacts down the supply chain or for organizations. I think there is a recognition from organizations and non-governmental organizations that it is important that we are supporting each other through this journey, and that there will be several lessons learned. I think the UK government's approach is the immediate reaction should not be, and that's it, we're not going to do business with you, because actually you do not understand the whole context of perhaps what may have transpired. So the general advice is to understand the specific incident or activity that may have occurred within your supply chain. Make sure you've got all the data and the facts. Make sure that several stakeholders have been consulted before getting to that point where you're saying, well, that's it, we're not going to do business with you. So I think a very considered approach is one that is generally recommended.
And just taking that and spinning it ever so slightly, there's a question here that says, are there any papers or resources showing how doing the right thing, being a responsible organisation, has led to better business outcomes, i.e. growth, revenue, stock increase, etc.? Because that would demonstrate that, you know, doing the right thing can lead to better outcomes. Do we have any resources along those lines to help people?
I can start with that, Tara. I think with the researcher hat, I think there are several resources out there. If you go to the Oxford website, Cambridge, Harvard, they all have specific research that's been done to demonstrate how ethical organizations and organizations that have incorporated sustainability within their business have become more profitable, whether that is through their supply chain and the ability to attract further business because they are doing the right thing, or from the context of being able to attract and retain talent. That is also another form of success, and actually depending on what aspects of performance growth and success we're measuring, there are several research out there that certainly highlight that doing the right thing leads to growth and it leads to better performance for organizations.
Excellent. There's a quick one here saying, B, you mentioned supply chain mapping. Is there anywhere where we can point people to read more on this?
Thanks, Tara. Yeah, there's, as I said, numerous organisations and open source tools available online that kind of go into the detail. You know, the first point I think would be looking at the UN Guiding Principles on Business Human Rights. That provides a very basic framework of understanding. I mean, the process itself is not basic, but it allows businesses to understand more about risk identification and mitigation, but their responsibilities to people rather than just profit. But in terms of supply chain mapping, there's lots of organizations. So there's an organization called SEDEX. They help companies with looking at different suppliers within the different tiers of their supply chain. There's numerous data platform providers that also enable businesses to input.
Oh no, we've lost you. That your mute's gone on.
Oh,
that you waved your arm and the mute went on.
Apologies. I was just saying that there's numerous data platforms also available. So there's one, just to name one, it's Traffic Analysis Hub. So this kind of allows businesses to input any supplier data that they may have, and then it maps it for them in a way that makes sense and allows them to see the areas of risk. So whether that's by geography or commodity, it's kind of enabling you to get a sense of what's happening in your supply chain, where are the risks, and only when you know what those risks are and where they're happening can you begin to mitigate them.
Excellent.
Can I just quickly come into that, Tara? Just a very top tip for me, the OECD guidelines on multinational enterprises. If you just do a quick Google search, has always been my stop place for all things supply chain.
Bedtime reading for us all there, Matty. We've come to the top of the hour, everybody, which means it's the end, which is sad news. But happy news is hopefully it's the first of many. So I'd like to thank Erica, B and Matty for being amazing panelists and taking the time out to answer all these questions. Apologies to those of you whose questions we didn't get to. Actually, we only got to about 10% of the questions that came in. So we'll pick more of them up next time, so we won't lose them. We'll feed them back through and see what we can do. And if you want more info, then you can contact us here. So please do. This is only successful if we all lean in. Those that care about this topic lean in, and others will lean in with us, as I genuinely believe that. So have a good rest of your day, everybody. Thank you for taking the time. Thank you, panelists. You've been amazing.